what's it about, this play, on the obvious level? Think about the plot. Antigone's brother Polynices has been killed. He was killed in an attack on Thebes, and so he's a traitor to Thebes. Creon, who is now king, refuses to allow Polynices to be buried because he claims that Polynices doesn't deserve this honor, given his brother Eteocles, he doesn't deserve the honor that was given to Eteocles because Eteocles, who was king, died defending Thebes, and Polynices died attacking Thebes, and Polynices killed his brother. Now, Antigone defies Creon's order and claims divine law is higher than his law. She buries Polynices, who gets unburied, and so she does it again. Second time around, she gets caught. Creon sentences her to death. He is punished by the end of the play with the suicides of his wife Eurydice and his son and Antigone's fiancé, Haemon. Now, this is Sophocles, right? So it's not so simple. The obvious complication is that Eteocles and Polynices kill each other, and so it's a mutual fratricide. And of course, with Antigone and Ismene, they are the offspring of Oedipus and Jocasta, and so they're the offspring of the incestuous marriage, whose and their father killed his father. Creon is their uncle. So things are more complicated than they seem at first glance, but there are less obvious ways that are actually even much more problematic. We want to know what exactly Antigone's motive is for doing this. It doesn't look as though it can be simply to bury Polynices, or it would have been possible for her to do it more cleverly and escape. Look at line 86 in Wyckoff and 99 in green. You get this. She's talking to her sister, and she says, "Oh no, shout it out. I will hate you still worse for silence, should you not proclaim it to everyone." So she asks Antigone to rat her out. So it's not simply to bury Polynices. There's more to it than that. It's clearly not simply to cause her own death. She could have killed herself. I mean, Eurydice did it. Jocasta did it. It's not simply an attachment to family or a loyalty to family as family. Look at lines 93 and 109. The larger number is always green, where Antigone says, "If you will talk like this, I will loathe you, and you will be adjudged an enemy, justly, by the dead's decision. Let me alone, and my folly with me." So, in effect, she says, if you talk like this, I will hate you. If you jump to line 895, 921, you get this. Is that what I want? Hold on. Yeah. She says here, when she's contemplating her own death, going to her tomb, "I am the last of them, and I go down in the worst death of all." The last of whom? Well, she's talking about the last of her family, but what about Ismene? If you go back to line 180, to lines 554 and 608, you get this. Ismene says, I cannot bear it, not even to share your death. Literally, she says, am I outside your fate? And as Antigone essentially says, life was your choice and death was mine. Take heart, you later on down the page, take heart, you were alive, but my soul died long ago. So in effect, Antigone, Ismene says, can't I share your fate? And Antigone essentially says no. So you put all that together, and in effect, she has disowned Ismene as her sister. Why? Well, because Ismene refused to help her bury her brother. But surely refusing to bury your brother should be a lesser crime than killing your own brother. If she can forgive Polynices for killing Eteocles and vice versa, Eteocles for killing Polynices, why is she so hard on poor Ismene? It's also not even clear why Antigone wants him buried. It's interesting that although it might have been easily inserted in the play, no one in the play ever says that the dead live in Hades, or that Polynices can't go to Hades unless he's buried. More important, I mean, elsewhere things like that are said. You think about the last books of the Iliad, so it's not it's not a strange thought, but nobody says that. Antigone doesn't say, Creon, you have to let me bury him or else he won't be able to go to Hades. And furthermore, what exactly does Antigone do? She buries him once by sprinkling dust over him. It's a sort of ritual burial, and we would understand such a move. She buries him once, but if the ritual is enough, then he's already buried the first time, and the fact that they scrape the dust off doesn't mean that he's unburied, so why does she have to do it again? And if a real burial is necessary, she's got to really get him under the ground, then Antigone will necessarily fail, and Ismene will be right when she says they're too weak to do it, because they can keep digging him up as long as Antigone can keep burying it. Also, how does she know Polynices was unburied? This is one of my favorite spots in the play, line 408 following, or in green 448 following. You get this. This is how it was. This is the sentry. When we came there with those dreadful threats of yours upon us, namely Creon, who threatened them, we brushed off all the dust that lay upon the dead man's body, heedfully leaving it moist and naked. We sat on the brow of the hill to windward, that we might shun the smell of the corpse upon us. Each of us wakefully urged his fellow with torrents of abuse not to be careless in this work of ours. So it went on until in the midst of the sky, the sun's bright circle stood still. The heat was burning. Suddenly a squall lifted out of the earth, a storm of dust, a trouble in the sky. It filled the plain, ruining all the foliage of the wood that was around it. The great empty air was filled with it. We closed our eyes, enduring this plague sent by the gods, when at long last we were quit of it. Why, then we saw the girl. So somebody just repeat to me what's just happened. It seems a little overdetermined, like you don't really need all this detail, but what does the detail tell us? What did they first do? She had buried the corpse by sprinkling dust on it. They went back, and Creon yelled at them and threatened them. So they went back and they scraped all the dust off. Then the gratuitous event happens. What happens after that? And Sophocles has the sentry describe the body as cold and moist. And then what happens? Huge dust storm, right? So you've got a moist, damp body that has been undusted. And then you have Sophocles saying, or the sentry saying, this moist, damp body was in the middle of a huge dust storm. And then Antigone comes along after the dust storm. How does she know the body's been unburied? You know what happens to something moist and damp when it's in the middle of a dust storm? It's clearly covered with dust. She's apparently capable of discerning her dust from other dust. So it's very unclear how she even knows that the body has been unburied. So switch for a minute. What about Creon's motive? If fratricide is the crime that makes it unlawful to bury Polynices, then what about Eteocles? He killed his brother too. So for Creon to distinguish between the action of Polynices and the action of Eteocles, he must think that fratricide is not the crucial issue. But then Polynices looks as though he's simply an enemy of Thebes. Now, in Athens, for example, at the time, there was a law according to which enemies could not be buried in Athens. But that didn't mean they couldn't be buried. It just meant they couldn't be buried in Athens. And so if they were dragged outside of the city, that was fine. So Creon's harshness in this matter, Polynices is, after all, his nephew, is somehow inexplicable. What do we have then? Our conclusion, our modified plot summary. Antigone's brother is no ordinary brother, but the offspring of an incestuous marriage, a traitor, and a fratricide. It's not clear why she wishes to bury him. It's not clear whether she does bury him. It's not clear why Creon wishes to prevent the burial. It's not even clear whether he does prevent it or whether he even thinks he's prevented it. It wasn't his idea, after all, to scrape the dust off the corpse. It's not even clear Antigone knows that Polynices was unburied. So you see, we've read enough Greek tragedy, but Sophocles now especially, to see that Antigone is in a way typical of Sophocles' tragedies. On the surface, it's smooth as silk, and you expect that everything follows. But then you push just a little bit, and it's riddled with puzzles once you try to think it through. Okay, so back to the obvious. The play is somehow about two conflicting claims on us. We've seen this before. On the one hand, the law of the political community, the polis, the city, and on the other hand, the law of the family. So Creon is to the polis, as Antigone is to the family, and so we suspect, having read the Oresteia, as male is to female. So the play points to these two conflicting notions of duty or morality, and so to understand it means to see how Creon stands for the polis and Antigone stands for the family, and why both must make claims on us. That's the sort of, not easy, but in a way the standard understanding of what's at stake. It is, I don't know if it's true any longer, it used to be true all the time that people would point to this as a play that's about the tension between the state and the individual, and that's actually quite wrong. Antigone doesn't stand for the individual. She does what she does out of loyalty to the family. So you have to at least begin with the tension between the family and the polis. Okay, so let's do Creon first. He's easier. By the way, it's funny, isn't it, that the play is called Antigone? It's, depending on which edition you're reading, it's 1,400 or 1,300 lines. Creon is on stage for about 1,000 of those lines, as opposed to Antigone's 450. So why does he call it Antigone? Why doesn't he call it Creon? She dies, but after all, it's easy to see that he's not very happy at the end of this play. Yeah. Although, in a way, it's not clear by the end of that play that there's a tragic fate awaiting Clytemnestra. In the next play, it's clear. Whereas here, Creon suffers enormously in this play. Suicide of his wife, suicide of his son, his family is destroyed. Still similar, right? Think about the polis. What does the city do for us? Now, if you look at the first stasimon, either line 330 or 368 is where it follows, we're told, we're told that the city is the peak of human artfulness. It's the thing that we make, the contrivance that we make for overcoming or taming a hostile nature. So, yeah, boats are great and plows are great, but the city is the peak of human invention. Now, Creon's remark then is interesting at line 193 or 180. We get this. It is impossible to know any man, I mean his soul, intelligence, and judgment, until he shows his skill in rule and law. I think that man, no, that's not right. I think that a man, supreme ruler of a whole city, if he does not reach for the best counsel for her, but through some fear keeps his tongue under lock and key. Him I judge the worst of any. I have always judged so, and anyone thinking another man more a friend than his own fatherland, I rate him nowhere. For my part, Zeus is my witness, who sees all. Always I would not be silent if I saw ruin, not safety, on the way toward my fellow citizens. I would not count any enemy of my country as a friend, a philos, because of what I know that she is, which gives us our security. If she sails upright and we sail on her, friends, philoi, will be ours for the making. In the light of rules like these, I will make her greater still. So, another point. In the play Antigone, there are more compounds of the word auto, which means self in Greek, than in any other play by Sophocles. It seems to point to the goal of the city, autonomy. The motive behind the greatest of human contrivances is autonomy, not being needy, being godlike. But there's an obstacle to this longing for independence and autonomy. The obstacle to complete independence, line 393 or 358, is not so hard to figure out. It's death. It looks as though political life can it can do things to overcome hunger, to overcome fear, to overcome virtually anything that we suffer while we live. It's in a way the comprehensive human association designed to do that on the one hand, but the one thing it can't really solve is the problem of death. The motive behind the greatest human contrivance is autonomy. It pushes that as far as it can, and it runs into death as an insurmountable obstacle. And so really, to fulfill its function, the city would have to overcome death. It is interesting how, in the 1844 manuscripts, when Marx is arguing for communism, he has to argue that communism can solve problems hitherto unsolvable in human society, and certainly problems hitherto unsolvable by political society. And so he's forced to argue that death is a social phenomenon. Now, that turns out to mean that our fear of death is a social phenomenon, and properly understood, it wouldn't be fearful, but it's the thing that always gets, the way he argues for it makes it clear that he knows in a way that in order to make the argument he wants to make, he will have to show that, and it's the greatest problem in a way. Hard to believe that that first sweaty night, wherever it happens to you in adolescence. I had my grandson announce to me, I was glad he announced it in this way because it meant it probably wasn't true, because you would never think of it in this way if it were true, that he had just had an existential crisis. And so I thought, oh, great. Somebody told him about existential crises. You wouldn't wake up in the middle of the night sweating thinking, I had an existential crisis. No, you'd wake up in the middle of the night saying, oh my God, I'm really going to die. There will be a time when I'm not there any longer and the world will stop. What does that mean? So the first reaction to that is a kind of terror ordinarily. Hard to believe that that terror is simply to be understood as a bourgeois phenomenon, especially since it's already present in Antigone, which is not taking place in a bourgeois society. So this is not to say you should read Marx. You should read Marx. He's interesting because he knows that this is in a way the great problem that he needs to overcome. Overcoming human alienation, if you think of it simply as a social alienation as a social phenomenon, as a problem of class consciousness and class warfare ultimately, then it has to mean, if that's really the structure of human life, it looks as though it has to mean that death has to be understood, the fear of death has to be understood in those terms. Hard to do. Okay. How does Creon, in a way, point to this problem? Look at lines 447 and 490. We get this. This is a sentry. No, that's not right. Hold on. Yeah. Okay. Now, Antigone, tell me shortly and to the point, did you know the proclamation against your action? Proclamation, edict. I knew it, of course I did, for it was public. And did you dare to disobey that law? Yes, it was not Zeus that made the proclamation, the edict, nor did justice, which lives with the gods below, enact such laws as that. For mankind, I did not believe your proclamation had such power to enable one who will someday die to override God's ordinances, written and secure. They are not of today and yesterday. So Creon calls his laws, his edicts, his proclamations laws. Antigone replies in terms of divine law. So if she's right about this, then it would be only by making the city itself divine that Creon could justify his action. By making his decree, his proclamation, have the status of divine law. This is in a way what the fight over the burial is all about. To politicize burial, to make it a denial, to make the denial of burial a political dishonor, means to politicize death. The only way to absolutize the claim of the city over human beings is to make it truly capable of doing what it claims to do. It's the super artifact capable of accomplishing everything that needs to be accomplished in order to make human beings autonomous, and therefore it has to overcome the problem of death. It has to politicize death. It has to claim that it doesn't cease to control us even in death. So line 211, 228, we get this. Bottom of my page. But he that is loyal to the city in death, in life alike, shall have my honor. Son of Menecius, so it is your pleasure to deal with foe and friend of this our city. To use any legal means lies in your power, both about the dead and those of us who live. So, supposing this to be Creon's view, we need to take a look at his view of the city. What does it mean that he absolutizes it? How does he go about absolutizing it? Let's start with his first speech. Right after Ismene and right after the prologue and the parados. Men, as for our city's fortune, the gods have shaken her when the great waves broke, but the gods have brought her through again to safety. For yourselves, I chose you out of all and summoned you to come to me, partly because I knew you as always loyal to the throne, at first when Laius was king, and then again when Oedipus saved our city, and then again when he died, and you remained with steadfast truth to their descendants, and until they met their double fate upon one day, striking and stricken, defiled each by a brother's murder. Now here am I, holding all authority and the throne in virtue of kinship, philia, with the dead. So why is he king? Specific bond, it's kinship, right? So first Laius, and then Laius' son, and then Oedipus' son, and then Creon because he's the closest living male heir, right? Hereditary monarchy. Is that a convincing argument? I mean, how did Oedipus become king? They didn't know he was Laius' son. He was from Corinth. So there's something really very preposterous about what he's arguing. He's arguing that there's a sort of direct line on the basis of which he's now king, but he's making an appeal. The ground of his authority is kinship, is philia, is the family. So Antigone may seem a strange choice to defend the family. We'll get to that later. The offspring of the incestuous family, and the rest of it is the spokesperson for the family. But Creon seems equally strange here. They made Oedipus king, but it had nothing to do with the family when they did that. So what does full devotion to the city amount to, according to Creon? When pressed, he has to use the language of the family, the non-contractual, unchosen association. So at line 180, or I think it's 170, you get this, where he says, well, let's start earlier at line 20, that's not earlier, in green at about line 204, I've always judged so, anyone thinking another man more a friend than his fatherland, not his own country, his fatherland, his patris, I rate him nowhere. And then further down, I would not count any of my country as a kin, as philos. If she sails upright and we sail on her, philoi will be ours. In consonance with this, I here proclaim to the citizens their brother edict. Further down the page, however, his common blood, same blood, Polynices, a returned exile who sought to burn with fire from the top to bottom his fatherland. So everywhere in this first speech, it's not only the explicit claim to hold the throne on the basis of family connections, the language is saturated with the language of the family. So this is borne out in a wonderful way by his later exchange with his son Haemon, who comes to him and says, you know, you're behaving like a tyrant. You can't do that. And what does Creon say to him? He tells him, you owe me absolute obedience because I'm your father. That's how he appeals to him. There's nothing worse than having your children disobey you in this way. But of course, if that were true, and if children owed that kind of obedience, all children owed that kind of obedience to their fathers, then in fact, the city would fall apart. Creon is simultaneously the king. He says, you can't bury Polynices, and Antigone is going to die because she attempted to do that. His decree is law. His son comes to him and says, you know what they're saying about you in the city? You're going to be careful, father. And he says, obey me because I'm your father, because of our kinship connection. But how many fathers are there in Thebes? Do they all have absolute authority over their children? And if they do, if Creon told Haemon to bury him after he died and the city said no, wouldn't Haemon have to do it? So the problem is he's both a father and a king, and he doesn't realize that there's got to be a difference between the two. What happens to the polis if all fathers can demand complete obedience? So he fails to see that he acts on the one hand as a father, on the other hand as a ruler, and that the two really coincide in him only accidentally. So Creon, in a way, does stand for the city, but his attempt to absolutize the city turns the city into a family. We're familiar with that from the autochthony problem. So his goal is, in a way, that perfect family love, philia, that binds citizens together unquestioningly with no thought of gain, no calculation. The autochthony myth that says we're all brothers and sisters. But in order to do that, of course, he has to appeal to something beyond what is ordinarily understood to be the political. To divinize the city in this way, he has to make it more than what it is ordinarily taken to be. Now, it's worth noting in passing that this city of brothers and sisters would mean what? If they were all brothers and sisters and it wanted to continue, it would mean incest. It would mean Antigone. It would mean the worship of the family. So we notice at the end of the play that Creon is going to be punished, not politically, but he'll be punished through his family. Wife commits suicide, son commits suicide. Notice, by the way, that he never, ever learns. He's told by Tiresias at the end of the play that he has to free the girl and bury Polynices. And that's the order in which Tiresias tells him to do it. So what does he do? He buries Polynices, and then he goes to free Antigone. And what does he do when he buries Polynices? We could read it. We'll read it maybe next time, but at the time after. But he comes upon him, and then they wash him and bathe him, and they build a pyre, and they burn him on the pyre It's got to take a long time, what they're doing. I mean, it would have been easy enough just to dig a hole and put him in it. He would have satisfied Tiresias. But he didn't do that. He turns it into a state funeral, a political honor. And the consequence of that is that Antigone dies. That if he hadn't done that, if he'd done what Tiresias told him to do, he would have gone to free her and then buried Polynices, first of all, and that would have meant that she was free. Or if he had simply done what he had to do and grudgingly put Polynices under the earth, he still would have had time to free Antigone. But the consequence of what he does is very much like what happens to Oedipus at the end of the play. You know, sort of popular version is he learns something terribly important and when he blinds himself, but then we discover, yeah, he sort of did, but then he commits the same kind of error by commanding Creon to abandon him on Mount Kithaeron. He's done this terrible thing and he's punishing himself. He's prescribing his own punishment and he's once again in imitating his father. What happens at the end of Antigone? Creon, who in a way made the mistake of divinizing the city, of making the city all important, is told by Tiresias, you can't do that, you have to free the girl. So he grudgingly does it, but the way in which he does it guarantees that she dies. And the content of the way in which he does it is that he politicizes it. To the very end, he in a way announces the authority of the city over death. So he still doesn't understand the difference between getting Polynices under the ground and honoring him. Ironically then, in order to defend himself from Antigone, Creon turns himself into Antigone. To do that, he abstracts from the two things to which the city can only really ever be a spectator: birth and death. He gives absolute importance to what happens in between. So Eteocles and Polynices' actions in war. And also, this has to do with his, we'll see this, I think, next time. This all has to do with his strange view that everything can be understood in terms of money or love of gain. Now, on the other hand, Antigone leaves the middle altogether out. She understands human beings only in terms of birth and death. The beautiful sign of this is line 501 or 465, where we get this. I think. Hold on. Oh, but I need to translate. As I remember, it's translated a little better in Wyckoff, but they both don't quite get the point. Let me do it this way. But if I dared to leave that corpse from my mother, dead and unburied. So one of the things that can mean is just the way everybody reads it. So Green has, but if I dared to leave the dead man, my mother's son, the man, my mother's son, no, the dead man, my mother's son, dead and unburied. That would have been a real pain. But if you read it sort of dumbly literally, she calls Polynices the corpse from my mother. And that would mean, of course, that in a way, Jocasta is the killer of Polynices. But Jocasta is the killer of Polynices only if, by giving birth to him at all, she guaranteed that he would die. Did you ever ask yourselves why we call it living? Couldn't you just as easily call it dying? I mean, as soon as you're born, you're dying. That's in a way what this curious remark is pointing to. So From Antigone's perspective, the real killer of Polynices is Jocasta, who gave birth to him. So for Antigone, what's important about Polynices is not what he did, but who he is. That's the meaning of the first sentence, which everybody mistranslates because it's impossible to translate it. If you were translating it, what does Green have? Is meaning my dear sister. So he just gives up. The Greek says something like, O common head of my very own sister is Mene. The common head part is not so bizarre as it looks on the face of it. When you think about the fact that we ordinarily take the face to be the absolute sign of individuality. If you look at someone from a distance and think that the person is someone you know because of body type or walk or whatever, and you get closer and then see that the face isn't right, then you say, well, I made a mistake. But it doesn't work the other way. The other way you would say, oh my God, look at how much weight you've lost, or oh my God, look at how much weight you've gained. That's what you don't say. But the interesting thing is that the individuality of the person is the face. So then you realize what a strange remark Antigone has made. She's said, O common head, O common head. What is that? O common sign of individuality. Yeah, I mean, you point to something real, but even so, what Antigone's doing is conflating what they have in common with what individuates is meaning. And so by doing that, essentially what she's saying is your individuality consists in your being sister. You are sister as such, and no more than that. You don't have an individuality independent of that. So that's in a way the sign that that's another version of the fact that for Antigone, it's not what Polynices did, it's who he is. And who he is her brother. Okay. That's Creon's sort of a first beginning. What about Antigone, whose name, by the way, there is if you call somebody Antigone or Antigonus in Greek at the time, it's usually a name that you give to a child after there's been a death of a previous child. So someone born in place of another. But literally it means something like anti-birth. So the question is, why is the defender of the family called anti-birth? See if we can sort of tease it out by looking at her attitude toward death. If you look at line 79, that's the only, fortunately they're not very far apart at the beginning, that's the only line number I have for this one. Antigone's language gets very suggestive. She says, I would not urge you now, nor if you wanted to act, would I be glad to have you with me. Be as you choose to be, but for myself, I myself will bury him. I will be kalon, noble or beautiful. It will be noble to die so doing. I shall lie by his side, loving him as he loved me. I shall be a criminal, but a religious one. Literally, I shall stop at nothing in pursuit of the holy. The time in which I must please those that are dead is longer than I must please those in this world, for there I shall lie forever. You, if you like, can cast dishonor on what the gods have honored. So Ismene sees something rather strange here. She says at line 101, Is that right? Hold on. You have a hot heart for cold things. The chorus also sees something strange in Antigone. Compare line 239. I'm sorry, this is only green. I thought I'd gotten all of them, but I left some out. We get this. There is none so foolish as to love his own death. And then compare that with line 504, where we get Antigone saying, we already read this. No, we didn't. Hold on. I know that I will die, of course I do, even if you had not doomed me by proclamation. If I shall die before my time, I count that a profit. How can such as I that live among such troubles not find a profit in death? So Antigone herself seems to know what sets her apart. Line 610, we get this part I read earlier. Life was your choice and death was mine. And then about 4 lines after that, take heart, you are alive, but my soul died long ago to serve the dead. Her connection to death is confirmed in the third Stasimon, which begins either line 781 or 849. And it's interesting because Antigone has just been condemned to be buried alive. And what does the chorus do? They sing a choral ode about love, a choral ode which ends with, your translation isn't really right, when I see Antigone making her way to her bridal chamber. That is rest for everyone. They liken her tomb to a bridal chamber. So Antigone, she's just been condemned to be buried alive, and the chorus sing a song about love, which ends by calling her tomb a bridal chamber. Now the chorus identify the goal of this love of death with what? A little further down, we get this. It was your own choice. Literally, it was autonomous. And alone among mankind you will descend alive. So let's try and put some of this stuff together by doing something even harder and more complicated. I want to look at the first Stasimon. It may be the most famous choral ode in Greek literature. We want to see more closely what the connection is between love of death, family versus city, and this new question of autonomy. Now, the Stasimon is a response dramatically to two things. It's got, the Stasimon itself has this very famous opening line where the chorus say this. It's 330 in Wyckoff and 368 in green. The chorus starts by saying, many are the wonders, ta dena, the canny/uncanny things. None is more denos, more wondrous, more canny, uncanny, than what is human being. I'm sorry? 330 if you're in Wyckoff, 368 if you're in green. So it's a response, the choral ode, First, to something Creon says at line 280 or 310, when he says this. They would not bow justly beneath the yoke to submit to me. I am very sure that these men hired others to do this thing. I tell you, the worst currency, nomisma, that ever grew among mankind is money. This sacks cities, this drives people from their homes. This teaches and corrupts the minds of the loyal to acts of shame. Is this what I want, or am I reading the wrong? No, it's further up the page, the beginning of the speech. Stop before your words fill even me with rage, that you should be exposed as a fool, and you so old. For what you say is surely insupportable when you say the gods took forethought for this corpse. It is out of excess of honor for the man. So Creon says, essentially, that the gods couldn't have buried Polynices, and therefore, even if those who buried him left no sign, it must have been human beings. So these human beings who buried Polynices would be denoi. They would be canny on the one hand, and yet uncanny on the other. They would be clever, and they would be terrible. But more fundamentally and more immediately, the chorus is a response to something the guard says, the sentry, this is at line 323 or 357. Green has, it's a bad thing if one judges and judges wrongly, literally. How Denos is the one to whom it seems falsely to seem. The guard unwittingly reveals the Denos character of human beings before the chorus even starts. That thing seem to us at all means we always get appearances. We never get a reality. So we need to hold on to that and try to understand what it means and why that gives rise to this chorus. The Stasimon really divides in four, the two strophic pairs. In the first strophe, let's read it. Many are ta dena, none is more denos than what is human. This it is that crosses the sea, with the south wind storming and the waves swelling, breaking around in roaring surf. It is presumably not he, but it again, who wears away the earth, oldest of gods, immortal, unwearied, as the plows wind across her from year to year, when it works her with the breed that comes from horses. So, first strophe, we'll come back to certain things, but simple point. Human beings are denos because they master inanimate objects, the sea and the earth. The first antistrophe, the tribe of the light-hearted birds it snares and takes prisoners the races of savage beasts and the brood of the fish of the sea with the close-spun web of nets. A cunning fellow is man, here masculine, aner. His contrivances make him master of beasts of the field and those that move in the mountains, so he brings the horse with the shaggy neck to bend underneath the yoke, and also the untamed mountain bull. End of the antistrophe. So first strophe, mastery of inanimate things. Antistrophe, mastery of wild animals, and it, which is what human beings have been referred to in the strophe, halfway through the antistrophe, turns into man. Second strophe. And speech or utterance and wind-swift thought and the tempers that go with city living, he has taught himself, and how to avoid the sharp frost when lodging is cold under the open sky and pelting strokes of the rain. He has a way against everything, and he faces nothing that is to come without contrivance. Only against death can he call on no means of escape, but escapes from hopeless diseases he has found in the depths of his mind. With some sort of cunning, inventive beyond all expectation, he reaches sometimes evil and sometimes good. So first, second strophe, the relation of human beings to themselves as contrivers of their own preservation. And then the final one, if he honors the laws of earth and the justice of the gods, he has confirmed by oath, high is his city, no city has he with whom dwells dishonor, prompted by recklessness. He who is so, may he never share my hearth, may he never think my thoughts. So the relation of human beings to others, namely the city and gods. So the straightforward meaning seems to be something like this. Human beings are the most denos of beings, the most simultaneously canny and uncanny. Being denos is what makes us special, but there is a certain doubleness that runs throughout. Denos, of course, means both canny or clever and uncanny or terrible, awful. Earth is first presented in the first strophe as material to be used, to be plowed, but later turns into a goddess, and indeed in the context looks like the highest goddess. You'd think there'd be something sacrilegious about plowing her up. And finally, not finally, but the weirdness at the beginning where throughout the first strophe and half of the second, human beings are referred to by a neuter this. So look also at the one limit on human beings. He has a way with everything. He faces nothing that is to come without contrivance. Only against death can he call on no means of escape. Now, I've written these stuff on the board. What did I do with the... It's funny what we've got. So that's this line. Pantoporos aperos ep uden erketai to melon. So all resourceful, and then that's a semicolon in Greek. Resourceless, he comes to the future facing nothing. So resourceless, he comes to the future facing nothing. Now, what's interesting about that is that in Greek of the time, there is no punctuation. There are no small letters, there are only capital letters. There are actually no spaces between words or sentences. So you have to figure out a lot. So that means this stuff, which comes later, could all disappear, and then you would be able to translate it somewhat differently. Resourcelessly, no. Resourcefully, resourceless, he comes to the future facing nothing. Or even more, resourcefully resourceless, he comes to nothing in the future. What would that mean? Look at line 90 and line 103, early on in the play. I know I am pleasing those I should please most, if you can do it, but you are in love with the impossible or the resourceless. Antigone is sort of hidden in the semicolon that we just erased. Unlike Creon, who thinks everyone acts for gain, and so everybody can be bribed, Antigone isn't going to try to get around death. In some strange way, she sides with it so that it becomes for her not a limit, but a goal. Start over. The obvious meaning of the passage with the semicolon is that the human flight from death leads to a daring battle, a denos confrontation with everything that threatens death. This confrontation is the soul of human artfulness, human cleverness, human contriving. But in a way, obviously, the daring has to come before the artfulness. Before we can devise any way or attempt to devise any way around death, there has to be an attitude toward death that doesn't simply involve escaping it, but involves facing it. It can't be the case that, your first response is the clever response. Your first response has to be the awareness, this deep awareness of your utter vulnerability, but without cowering. Now, this all comes out, I think, more clearly in the second curious sentence in the second antistrophe that corresponds to this one in the second strophe. So that's the second. Hupsipolis, apolis, hoto to mekalon, tsunesti tomas karen. So high is the city, Hupsipolis, semicolon, but cityless, apolis, is he whom the not beautiful or not noble, the ignoble, dwells, thanks to Karin, daring, Tolmas. So high is the city, cityless is he whom the not kalon dwells, thanks to daring. But once again, if you drop the punctuation, which wasn't there in the original Greek, it turns into something different. With whomever, thanks to daring, the ignoble lives, for him, high is the city, and there is no city. What would that mean? Think Antigone again. Her daring reminds the city of its source in something beyond it, above it. So in a way, it describes the city, But for that very reason, at the same time, it necessarily reveals that the city is not what's important to her. So the odd thing about, for example, understanding the law of the city to be grounded in divine law is that that very acknowledgement means that you have, in a way, done an end run about the law of the city, because the important thing is what, if you're in touch with what grounds the city, then in a certain way, that's what's important. Now, Creon unwittingly reveals the same thing at line 162 or line 179, when he says this at the beginning of his first speech: "Men, as for our city's fortune, the gods have shaken her when the great waves broke, but the gods have brought her through again to safety. So they endangered us, and they were simultaneously the source of our salvation." So it's not an accident that Earth appears in the initial strophe, both as a goddess to serve, as a measure or a standard, and as something to be conquered. The Stasimon is in its form a perfect representation of the problem. You could say the very sentences that reveal the meaning of the Stasimon also conceal the meaning of the Stasimon. The doubleness of the way you can read these two is, in a way, meant to mimic the doubleness of this word denos, canny and uncanny. The denos character of human beings is that what makes conquest or meaning possible is obliterated by the success of that conquest or meaning. So think about cliches. Think about how many of them you find when you read Shakespeare. What's the life of a cliche like? Can somebody think of a cliche? I can't think of any except the ones that are so old that I'm not even sure they're cliches anymore. But a stitch in time saves nine. That's a cliche, right? And you hear it and you say, yeah. But think about the first person who said it. It must have been really shockingly brilliant, you know? Did you hear what he said? Stitch in time saves nine. That's really good. And so it reminds me of something that, what's his name, the painter who was a friend of Oscar Wilde's. Why am I blocking on this? Whistler said to Wilde when he heard they were at a party and someone said something incredibly witty. And Wilde said, "Oh, I wish I'd said that." And Whistler said, "You will, Oscar, you will." Right? So in a way, that's the way we respond to cliches. Somebody says something, I mean, not cliches, but things that are really witty or really telling or really interesting, and they get repeated, and then they get repeated, and then they get repeated, and then they get repeated. And then, 100 years later, you're saying, "Oh my God, stop it already. That's a cliche." So it turns out that, in a way, the very thing that made it powerful guarantees that eventually it will be taken for granted and won't be powerful. Or think of a thinker who seems very different from all of these people. You know the famous line from Thomas Hobbes, "Life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and a continual war of every man against every man." This is his statement that grounds the founding of human society. So it turns out that once you realize that, it's better to be in any kind of society in order to gain safety. So you could say a version of the first Stasimon. It's where, human beings are the most denos beings. Why? Because they create the greatest of artifacts. What is that? The city, because the city protects you from this terrible fear of violent death. And then gradually, of course, Hobbes knew this as well, the thing that if it really is fear of violent death that pushes you into political life, then the more successful political life is at alleviating that fear, the more you'll take it for granted. And the more you take it for granted, the less you appreciate the city that saved you from the fear of violent death, and the more likely you are not to take it seriously. It's just a political version of a cliche. You get used to the safety, and therefore you don't recognize any longer the possibility of the state of nature where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and a continual war of everybody against everybody. So in a way, what the Stasimon is about that we are clever. We're incredibly Denos clever in creating devices that alleviate our situation on the one hand, and on the other hand, that cleverness could never take off at all unless there were an initial recognition of the vulnerability of our situation, unless you could say you stand naked in front of the threat of death without any artifact, without anything to protect you. You have to first do that before you can do the second, and doing that is Denos in a way that doesn't have to do with cleverness at all. It has to do with a kind of awesomeness. So let's start over again. The first Stasimon praises the artfulness of human beings. Human beings whom the chorus call a neuter this, will do everything. They are panorgoi. They will stop at nothing in the pursuit of the holy. Antigone, they will do everything. Antigone had earlier described herself back at line 74-84 as someone who would stop at nothing in the pursuit of the holy. So human beings' resourcefulness is really the same as a kind of criminality, and leads finally to political life. So think about what we saw last time, the connection between founding cities and fratricide. Civil life begins in something terrible, Denos. We have to first confront our natures as mortal before we can devise means for overcoming our natures. But this artfulness leads to a certain smugness, a certain self-satisfaction. It leads to Creon, which of course it was designed to do. That's the whole point. I mean, if you're going to live without constant fear of death, if you want to live well, you want to live without constant fear of death, and that's the whole point of establishing the city. But any genuine praise of this quality of human beings has to bring to light what it's a response to. Or you could say there's no genuine praise of canniness that doesn't reveal the uncanny ability to stand defiant, naked, without artifice. In particular, any praise of the highest human artifact, the polis, has to willy-nilly point to what is higher than the polis. There's no praising it without pointing to what it's for, which is always beyond it. So, if Creon is in a way implies the more obvious reading of the two sentences, Antigone points to the less obvious but deeper meanings of the two sentences. In a simple sense, then, what's the meaning of Antigone's love of death, to come back to what we're trying to connect? She somehow sees that to celebrate the city, human as in a way identical to human artifice, one has to look beyond it to what makes it possible. Or you could say only the threat of death, for Antigone, only the threat of death makes human nobility possible. So if you love human nobility, that means in some sense you love the threat of death. That's what she sees that Creon doesn't see. Okay, so that's two of our issues. What does all of this have to do with the family, which she defends so absolutely? The family is connected to love, erotic love, by way of generation, and also by way of love of one's own. O common head of my very own sister Ismene. These two are connected because generation is, in a way, a means of preserving your own. You can't live forever, but you take pride in generating a family that potentially could extend itself on forever. Oneself it provides for oneself a kind of immortality. So you could say the family seems at first to provide another option in the face of death, a natural, non-artificial option, which is unavailable to the polis. Now, why then the coupling of love and death in Antigone? If love is understood as sexual and procreative, its end is generation, then within it, there is necessarily an acknowledgement of death. To generate another self as a sort of replacement, Antigone means unwittingly accepting one's own death. So the survival of one's own points to the death of oneself. Procreation, then, as an alternative, is ultimately as self-destructive as the city. Antigone, then, means anti-birth because for Antigone to love her family means for her to love her own in a way that turns out to be doubly destructive. On the one hand, the birth of offspring. Think about the alternative to Antigone, which is so often in this play, Ismene, who chooses life and the generational family. Notice, by the way, at no time in this play does Antigone ever mention her marriage to Haemon. On the other hand, Antigone's love of the family is destructive by being anti-birth and therefore bringing an end to one's family. Let's see if we can put it together. Antigone in this play is the defender of the family, the pure family. The pure family is based on the principle love of one's own, as opposed to what's not one's own. The difficulty is that finally it looks as though love of one's own involves incest. That has to do with who Antigone is and why she's chosen for this role. So Antigone, as a member of the pure family, cannot belong to any family but her own family. Incest, then, points to the problem of autonomy. And Antigone can either marry Haman, whom she never acknowledges to be her fiancé, who is not her own, and therefore create a family by destroying a family, because she'd no longer be, her attachment to her family would no longer be pure. Or she could follow Oedipus's example, his unwitting example, and marry within her family, if Polynices or Eteocles were still alive, and that she has thoughts, unconscious thoughts of this, is clear from that earlier passage where she talks about lying with him in Hades. So she could follow Oedipus and marry within the family, but then she'd destroy a family by creating a family, because in fact, you can't have that kind of these kinds of mixed roles in the family. In either case, she would fail. What does that mean? The perfect family could exist only in a way in some place like Hades, in a timeless present where it didn't have to reproduce itself. The perfect family is, in a way, a set of relations. That family, if it were a family out of time, would be non-generational. So in order to cleanse the family, to purify it, it looks as though Antigone would have to reconstitute it in Hades. She can worship it as pure only as dead. And therefore, in a way, dead brothers are more important to her than living sisters, who might also turn out to be mothers. This is, in a way, what links together the three elements of our problem. Antigone's love of death is identical to her attachment to the family, her absolute attachment to the family, because the only alternatives would be incest on the one hand and exogamy on the other, marrying outside the family. Neither are possible to the person who wishes to celebrate absolutely the family. Now, the peculiarity of all of this is this. The family without eros, without generation, isn't really the family. What is it? This eternal, this timeless set of relations? Well, it looks at first glance, you get Oedipus and Jocasta up here, and down here you get Polynices, Eteocles, Ismene, and Antigone. But this family is put together on the basis of generation. These people are all connected horizontally in a way, but not vertically. And of course, in a weird way, Oedipus is too. But it looks as though in order to eternalize it, when you take the procreative element out of it, which it looks as though you have to do in a timeless setting, you get rid of Oedipus and Jocasta up here, then you've got this essentially horizontal relation, a fraternal sororal relationship without generation, so no parents. What is that? This artificial relation in which everybody is related to everybody as a brother and as a sister. It's the city. So Antigone has become Creon. And what the city strives for in its way has been identified with what the family strives for in its way. Still, there's a difference. To make her city possible, Antigone had to put it somewhere else, to relocate it in some place like Hades. And by doing that, she has introduced the divine as an issue. We're not going to do that today. We'll pick it up there next time. But you see, there's this strange thing that happens in this play. You have this fundamental tension which is, on a simple level we're all familiar with. We talked about it when we talked about Agamemnon and the Oresteia, where it looks as though you have a fundamental duty to the family, a fundamental duty to the city. Creon stands for the one and defends it and pushes it all the way. And his defense of the city turns on the family. It grounded in the family. Antigone pushes the family all the way, the pure family. She pushes it all the way, and she ends up with something that looks suspiciously like the city. So each of them in some way, they cross and turn into their opposites. We need to figure out why that's happening. Okay.